Well, good morning and welcome to the 6th Fall 2020 webinar session of our 21st year at Chappaqua Foreign Policy. In a second, I will introduce the facilitator of today's program, who will then introduce the topic and our guest for today's presentation. Please be aware that, like all our programs in the last several years, today's program will be recorded and then added to our library for later remote viewing. At the conclusion of the lecture, our session facilitator will lead the audience discussion, which will be via typed questions in Zoom Q&A. Please do not use the chat function when trying to present a question to the speaker. We will do our best to feed as many of those questions to our speaker as possible in the time remaining. Now, for those who have not participated in this format before, Zoom Q&A can be activated by dragging your cursor to either the top or bottom of your screen. Now that will depend on your version of Zoom that you're using and what type of device you have. Please press enter after typing your question. So at this point, now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Mal Nietzsche, who is the host of today's session.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Tyler. Our topic today is rethinking U.S.-Latin relations, Latin American relations. Over the past several years, the quality of democracy has eroded in numerous countries in Latin America, along with the public satisfaction on how democracy is working. Venezuela has descended into a dictatorship under President Nicolas Maduro, and Cuba and Nicaragua are ruled by authoritarian governments, repressing the political opposition. Jair Bolsonaro, a retired military officer, appears to be firmly in control as the 38th president of Brazil. In 2019, many countries in the region experienced social unrest fueled by political factors such as fraudulent elections, weak democratic institutions, politicized judicial systems, public corruption scandals, high levels of crime and violence, and organized crimes effect on state institutions. Economic factors such as declining or stagnant growth rates, high levels of income inequality, and increasing poverty also increased social pressure. Under the Trump administration, U.S. relations with Latin America and the Caribbean generally has moved toward a more confrontational approach from one of engagement and partnership during the past administration. In 2018, the State Department set forth a framework for U.S. policy toward the region, reflecting continuity with long-standing regional U.S. policy priorities. But the framework appears to be at odds with the administration's sometimes antagonistic actions and statements on immigration, trade, and foreign policy. Where are we now? And where we like to be going under a new U.S. administration? We are most fortunate today to have with us a scholar, an educator, and a deep background. Abraham F. Lowenthal is a scholar, policy advisor, and serial institution builder. He has published 3 single-authored books, 18 symposium volumes, and numerous essays, including 8 in Foreign Affairs magazine on U.S. Latin American relations, Latin American politics, democratic transitions, and California's global role. Dr. Lowenthal was founding director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Latin American program, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the Pacific Council on International Policy. He has worked at the Ford Foundation, the Princeton Center for International Studies, the Brookings Institute, and for 28 years at the University of Southern California, where he is now emeritus. Of specific interest today, Dr. Lowenthal worked with Dick Dye from 1970 to 1972 in Lima, Peru as an assistant representative. Many of you in our audience will remember Dick as the senior member of the Foreign Policy at Chappaqua Planning Committee. Dick passed away last November, and Abe contacted Anita Dye to offer to deliver today's memorial lecture. I know that Anita is with us today. Dick's son, Rick, is with us remotely from Connecticut. There are family members on the West Coast and even one in Chile. So this is an international program with an international audience. I don't see Abe's picture on the screen with me.
He's there.
He's there. Let me see.
Yes.
Click.
Hit,
Oh, I
hit
see. There
gallery
he is.
view.
I see him
Okay,
now.
Okay.
So Abe, welcome to Chappaqua. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mal. It is indeed a special honor to speak at Chappaqua Library on this occasion, marking a year since the passing of Dick Dye, such an active member of the library and its foreign affairs discussion group. Dick spoke to me with enthusiasm about this forum and the quality of its members, speakers, and discussions. He graciously invited me to speak in the discussion group, and we agreed to make this a priority for 2020. I was looking forward to spending some good time with him, reflecting on our shared and different experiences, which we had begun discussing and working together on a book about one of our friends and mentors, Calvin Silver. Dick was a consummate professional with very substantial experience in the Foreign Service in Southeast Asia, then for 20 years in the Ford Foundation in Asia, Latin America, and New York, and finally as Executive Vice President of the International Institute for Education, the most important US program to promote international exchange of university students, professors, and professionals. As Mal said, I worked closely with Dick from 1970 to 1972, reporting to him as the representative he was of the foundation in Lima, Peru. I have never had a more effective boss, inspiring my best work by encouraging initiatives, taking my perspective seriously, providing daily examples of efficient and thoughtful decision-making, execution, and follow-up, masterful personnel recruitment and supervision, and consistently providing helpful, critical feedback in such a positive way that it didn't feel critical at all. Dick's personality, temperament, and philosophy combined two important traits that are not often found together. He was a committed optimist about the importance and work of building a better world, investing in education and training, strengthening and supporting institutions, and protecting human rights, refugees, and the vulnerable. But he was also prudent and measured about promoting those core values. He was never preaching, always respectful, committed to listening and learning, not given to imposing, lecturing, or instructing. Cultivating this combination of important qualities is, I think, more important than ever in today's world. Those of us who worked with Dick Dye are lucky to have had such a model and mentor. May his memory continue to be a blessing for his family, for all who knew him, and for the many persons who benefited from his devotion to internationalism, education, and development. I will turn now to the talk I have been preparing on the challenging question of what US-Latin American relations will be like under the Biden administration, and what initiatives and policies the Biden administration might adopt in its approach to Latin America. I have never given this lecture before. I have been in the process of preparing it the last several days. And to be perfectly honest, I had given myself another hour and a half this morning to work on the last part of this presentation when I suddenly discovered that this meeting was not at 1 o'clock your time, 10 o'clock my time, but rather at 10 o'clock your time, 7 o'clock my time. So I'm barely getting started here, but I'll do my best to develop the last part of the lecture on the fly. When Joe Biden becomes president of the United States on January 20th, 2021, as we expect, he will face a combination of challenges, uncertainties, and constraints, probably greater than any US president since Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. The COVID-19 pandemic rages more violently in the United States and Latin America than anywhere else in the world, and than ever before in this pandemic cycle. The damage has already done to economies, societies, and citizens will be difficult to repair. Moreover, as a result of climate change, natural disasters have been occurring with greater frequency and more damaging consequences than ever before, especially in the United States and its closest neighbors in the Caribbean basin. While the time available for reducing global warming is ebbing away month by month. These two challenges have exposed serious weaknesses in the security of production supply chains, access to basic goods in a system based on just-in-time delivery, the adequacy of hospitals and other emergency facilities and equipment, and residential patterns and infrastructure. The viability of long-standing modes of work, education, entertainment, worship, lifestyles, consumptions, and community have been put in doubt. Familiar assumptions about the future of global capitalism and the economic role of the state have also been questioned. The foreign policies of the Trump administration on its way out have raised questions about the future role of the United States in a turbulent world. After its withdrawal from multiple international organizations, agreements, and commitments, its deliberate flouting of international law and norms, and the unprecedented severe weakening of the Department of State and other institutions necessary to manage international relations of the United States. This damage has also applied, as Mal was suggesting, in Latin America, where relations have been on the downside during these last 4 years, with a stance of demand, nationalism, even some chauvinism from the standpoint of the United States, and the imposition of US policies on immigration and other matters that have not been welcomed in the region. There are problems elsewhere in the world too. Europe's demographic, political, and socioeconomic trends are deteriorating. Regional institutions there have been weakened, in part because of US attacks. Growing anxieties about China's increasing economic, political, military, and cultural influence, and its geopolitical and geoeconomic ambitions, including in the Western Hemisphere, have been multiplying, creating tensions between the United States and its allies and partners in Latin America and elsewhere about how to respond to China's emergence. The likelihood of further proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran as well as in North Korea, and the possibility that they might be used, raise major new fears and instabilities. Democratic governance, moreover, is severely challenged in several countries around the world, including the United States. The 2020 elections worked well in terms of participation, fairness, and execution, but they highlighted the frailties of the US political system and America's deep cleavages. The United States is now divided almost equally between two groups: those who are largely content with the underlying trends of US society and the chances of further improving them within our system, and those, on the other hand, who are alienated from and resentful of the system, institutions, urban dwellers, and coastal elites. Many of the latter group are skeptical of science, expertise, meritocracy, and the role of mainstream media. They feel threatened by cultural changes that offend their values and trigger nostalgia for the United States as it was before the 1960s. Their alienation has been stoked by Donald Trump and facilitated by the social media. All these realities, and I see them as realities in the discussion period, perhaps we'll hear other points of view, will surely constrain the Biden administration in many ways, beginning with a very close balance of power in Congress, which is in turn a reflection of the national divide. Barack Obama and Joe Biden in 2009 inherited a financial crisis and a collapsing economy, but they took office with a clear mandate and firm control of Congress. Biden, however, will take office with a bare majority in the House of Representatives, probably a minority in the Senate. And he will need to make compromises with Republicans in order to secure congressional passage of any legislation. This, in turn, will risk opposition from his own party's progressive wing and will increase the possibility of losses in the midterm election of 2022. The Biden administration, I think, therefore, will have to concentrate first and foremost, not on foreign policy, let alone on Latin America, but on its difficult domestic challenges, to reinforce its legitimacy in the wake of the doubts Trump has stirred up, to organize, gain public support for, and execute a national strategy for combating the pandemic, provide economic relief and progress toward incorporation in a changed economy for millions of workers in dire need, shore up businesses, small and large, as well as state and local governments, and build back better by making the economy more inclusive and sustainable. It will be very hard to do all that Biden has promised: provide jobs, protect the environment, reduce inequalities, improve public transportation, provide affordable and universal health care, end homelessness, assure digital access for all, invest massively in infrastructure, improved and affordable education and innovative research, and furnish job training, child care, and care for the elderly. Very, very tall order, and all while avoiding inflation. The prospects for US-Latin American relations during the Biden period will not only be conditioned by these US priorities and difficulties, but also by Latin America's own profound problems. Most Latin American countries have absorbed drastic economic downturns and suffered huge casualties and high costs from the pandemic. Revelations of gross corruption have undermined trust in democracy, political parties, politicians, and elites. Many Latin American societies are deeply polarized. Several have experienced violent street protests. Even in Chile, a country which hasn't seen such violence in many decades. Many societies are deeply political and institutional decay in many countries, from Argentina, Brazil, and Chile to Peru and Colombia, as well as the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, not to mention the authoritarian rule in Venezuela and Nicaragua, present the greatest regional crisis of governance in many decades. The issues are different in each country and must be addressed nationally and domestically, which make multilateral approaches on any issue more difficult, even in a period when global geopolitical transformations might otherwise help open the way for stronger regional and perhaps inter-American arrangements. Given all these harsh realities, the chances that the Biden administration can and will propose major initiatives designed to chart a new course for US-Latin American relations must be rated as negligible to nil. This is just not the time for a new alliance for progress, a mature partnership, or a trade agreement for all the Americas. What we should anticipate instead, I think, are first, US efforts to begin rebuilding this country's soft power by rejoining various international organizations that the Trump administration took the United States out of, dropping the frequent use by the Trump administration of public bullying techniques, strengthening the State Department as well as other international security and foreign policy institutions of the United States in order to build our country's diplomatic capacity. There surely will also be a marked change in tone and style, something which could be demonstrated effectively at the 9th Summit of the Americas, which are scheduled to be hosted by the United States during 2021, as well as in other bilateral and sub-regional meetings. These opportunities will be a place to seek out and genuinely listen to and consider Latin American ideas and proposals to confront shared challenges, including public health, global warming and environmental protection, the trafficking of guns, persons, and narcotics, the need to strengthen international law and governance, and to support the protection, strengthening of, and achievement of democratic governance, a shared value of the peoples of the Americas. The new administration should also seek Latin American ideas and offer US proposals about how the countries of the Western Hemisphere can best respond to both the challenges and the opportunities posed by China's stunning rise and its increased, indeed striking, presence in the Western Hemisphere. This consultative approach, rather than attempts to impose US concepts and preferences in order to persuade Latin American countries to renounce their by now vital economic and commercial relations with China, should be something high on the agenda. At the 9th Summit and beyond it, we should expect efforts by the United States government to induce Latin American participation in and support for policies the United States adopts as its domestic priorities, as well as calls for proposed collaboration on shared issues that require cooperation with Latin American and Caribbean nations in order to be effective. First, inter-American cooperation in responding to the pandemic, especially by assuring that the vaccines which will be coming out are very widely and effectively administered throughout the Americas, would be a very good way to protect vital human interests, vital to them and to us, because these diseases do not respect borders. while also demonstrating a return by the United States back to the norms, the practices, and the language of this country's best democratic tradition. An early call by President Biden for regional high priority cooperation in fighting the pandemic among all the countries of the Americas on a humanitarian basis, and including Cuba and Venezuela, would be both a public health and an international political 10th strike. Second, the Biden administration's emphasis on climate change should be a salient aspect of its relationship with all the countries of the Americas. Conceived and carried out with full respect for national sovereignties, as well as the protection of the planet as a whole. Binational, sub-regional, hemispheric, and global approaches should all be pursued in fighting global climate change. There should be an emphasis on protecting the Amazon and other areas under threat from both human activity and other causes of climate change. The new administration should also move forward with designing transitions toward a greener economy in cooperation with interested countries of the Americas, seeking synergies and economies of scale that might help accelerate necessary adaptation. Third, the Biden administration should use the Summit of the Americas as well as other bilateral and sub-regional meetings to seek and genuinely listen to, oops, that's a paragraph I already incorporated. This is what I meant. I was working on the latter part. To the extent that the Biden administration has sufficient bandwidth to address international issues beyond those I have already mentioned, much of its attention should focus on the so-called intradomestic agenda. Intradomestic may not be part of your active vocabulary. Very few people use the term. It was invented by a colleague in the Council on Foreign Relations in the 1970s. It refers to those issues that combine international and domestic facets, hence intradomestic. Issues that cannot be successfully addressed by domestic policies by any one country alone. Public health, global warming are two examples. Immigration, employment, narcotics, and crime are others. Many of these are already issues high on the agenda in US Latin American relations, fraught with legacies of conflict and imposition, but also with some instances of important improved cooperation over the last decade that receded somewhat during the Trump years, but I believe could be resuscitated by the Biden administration. A prime example of this is immigration policy. Certainly, the immigration policies of the Trump administration have severely damaged US Latin American relations and the image and soft power of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. The Biden administration should, and probably will, early on, reverse much of this rhetoric and much of the substance of US immigration policy under Trump, particularly by reforming practices at the border, particularly the separation of children from families and the treatment of unaccompanied minors, as well as the procedures for evaluating refugee status. It should also move toward providing eventual pathways to citizenship for long-term residents of the United States. And it should immediately, perhaps by executive order, assure residential status for the so-called dreamers. That is, those who came to the United States as children and have grown up entirely in this country. The new administration should also take opportunities to celebrate the achievements and contributions of immigrants, including in the battling of the pandemic, caring for its victims, and developing the vaccines, as well as those doing military and police service. It will only be able to accomplish such immigration reforms by lowering the temperature of public discourse about migration policy. This will require, on the one hand, humane and respectful treatment of immigrants, and on the other, making it clear that the United States will control its borders and will strengthen cooperation with Mexico and its neighbors to make that possible. Let me say a little bit now in telegraphic terms about some of the most problematic bilateral and sub-regional relationships. First, to be frank, effective cooperation in managing international problems and opportunities would be significantly improved if the United States could work well together on the agenda I have been discussing. But this will be difficult while Brazil is governed and its relevant public departments are managed by those currently in power. President Bolsonaro and his followers have hyper-nationalist, anti-international, anti-scientific, and anti-cosmopolitan views that make Donald Trump's approaches almost benign by comparison. The fact that for his own political reasons, President Bolsonaro chose to make very clear his affection for and support of President Trump doesn't hide the fact that the approaches Brazil is taking on its domestic and international problems are very often antagonistic to those the United States will take under Biden. All the Biden administration really can do for now is to make it consistently clear that the United States stands ready to work with Brazil on the basis of mutual national respect and without preconditions whenever Brazil is ready to join in constructive discussions to face shared problems and opportunities, including the issues of environmental protection, the future of the Amazon, and others which are sensitive to Brazil. The Biden administration will also have to exercise patience and diplomacy working with Brazil. We should all be conscious of the fact that just as elections have changed the direction of national leadership in the United States, so they might well in Brazil in the 2022 national elections scheduled in that country. In the municipal elections, which were held on Sunday, the followers of Bolsonaro were very soundly defeated in almost every race around the country, in all of the major cities. And so Bolsonaro's hold on Brazil is probably of finite time frame and direction. Meanwhile, the United States can look for areas where Brazil and the United States might be able to cooperate, even under current conditions. And I think the trade area is the place to look for that kind of cooperation. I think the United States should be open to carrying forward trade discussions with Brazil to expand commerce between the two countries and reduce obstacles to trade that still exist. The United States should also expand its support for non-governmental programs that address particular issues in the health and other fields. Second, as the United States reckons with its own experience in protecting democratic governance from real threat, it cannot ignore the gross interference with democracy and human rights in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and the threats to democracy that may emerge in other countries. The Biden administration must articulate clearly and consistently its commitment to fundamental human rights, including free and fair elections and freedom of speech and assembly. But it must also make it clear, as the Trump administration intentionally did not, that the United States will not undertake military intervention to substitute foreign imposition for domestic self-rule. By making both these points together and clearly, the Biden administration can begin to participate in and support a path forward in Venezuela. I think that can only occur through international negotiations with the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan Democratic Organization, and civil society organizations in Venezuela, including the church, professional associations, and universities, as well as the corporate sector. Such negotiations should work to establish interim arrangements that will make possible free and fair elections while recognizing and protecting the legitimate rights of those in the current government as well as in the opposition to have protection for their physical integrity, human rights under the rule of law. Such a negotiated agreement would require hard compromises on both sides. I have no doubt about that. But with a colleague from Chile, Sergio Bitar, we did a study of democratic transitions in 9 countries around the world: in Chile, Brazil, and Mexico, in South Africa and Ghana, in Spain and Poland, in the Philippines and Indonesia. In all of those 9 countries, it was hard to imagine how the authoritarian government would end, how it would be removed. And yet, successful transitions to democracy occurred in all those countries, and there are lessons to be learned from those experiences. I might mention that I've been actively involved in discussions with Venezuelan colleagues about how the lessons from these 9 transitions might apply or might provide experience worth drawing upon in the Venezuelan case. A peaceful negotiated settlement in Venezuela would no doubt also depend in part on commitments by and the involvement of Cuba, Russia, and China, as well as the Lima group of Latin American nations, and including Canada, and countries from the European community. The international community played important positive roles in many of the democratic transitions I just mentioned. And this should also be part of the approach to Venezuela. But the United States has to understand that cooperating with these countries depends on a give and take process, not on simply the United States government dictating how Venezuela should be handled. Some of you will no doubt wonder how I can suggest cooperation with Cuba. After all, Cuba and the United States have had antagonistic relations now for 60 years. My assessment is that the Cuban leadership understands that its future depends on achieving a mutually respectful and constructive relationship with the United States. That is what was behind the decision that was made not only by Barack Obama, but perhaps much more significantly by Raul Castro, to turn toward a new path in relations with Cuba between Cuba and the United States. And although that path has not progressed far and has been reversed in some ways during the Trump years, there are indications of Cuban interest in living in a more stable environment, indications which are not just verbal but concrete, including the role that Cuba played in promoting the peaceful settlement of Colombia's civil war. Finally, I have not yet talked about Mexico. And yet Mexico is the country in Latin America that has the greatest impact on the United States in so many ways, which we in Southern California have experienced for many decades, but which are increasingly felt in other parts of the United States as well.
What's the matter?
The United States and Mexico are so intertwined.
There's one upstairs.
Intergovernmental,
Yes.
corporate, labor, societal, and educational levels, through commerce, through migration, through the flow of ideas, that it's hard to really separate the futures of the two countries. One of the under-discussed stories of the last 25 years is how much of a change there has been in those years within Mexico and in US-Mexico relations toward greater cooperation on a number of issues: trade and investment, the treatment of migrants and of US retirees in Mexico, public health, education, law enforcement, intelligence, border management, among others. Sensitive, skillful, and sustained management of US-Mexico relations will surely be an imperative for the Biden administration. But just as I was frank in talking about Brazil, so I must say that the problems of managing US-Mexico relations are complicated by the unique approaches under the current leadership of Mexico under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is his own populist and demagogue. This too will take diplomacy and patience, but there are so many issues in the mutual interest of Mexico and the United States that patience and diplomacy are worth investing in. Indeed, in my mind, I can imagine, starting with Mexico, that the Biden administration might move, at least at the conceptual level, perhaps setting the basis for a future administration, toward a more far-reaching approach to develop more conscious and mutually agreed cooperation on economic and social development, global warming, natural disasters, public health, law enforcement, and other issues throughout the near abroad, that is, the countries closest to both the United States and Mexico, the countries in the Central America and the Caribbean. This isn't the time or place to spell this vision out in detail, but I flag the topic for future discussion. Perhaps someday we'll have another chance to talk about that question. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm glad to participate now in a give and take discussion, hearing comments and questions and attempting to the best of my ability at this hour of the morning to respond to them.
Thank you, Professor Lowenthal. That's a very comprehensive coverage of a very difficult and diverse area. Thank you also for your tribute to Dick Dye. It's always amazing to me that although you think you know someone well, you can always learn something more about them, about their past, about some of their activities, unfortunately, after their passing. Let me start the questioning in the following way. One of the things we hear these days is that both China and to an extent Russia are really working hard to establish relationships, commercial and other relationships in Latin America. How significant is this? Where it's likely to lead? How will that affect any kind of foreign policy with Latin America?
Well, first of all, you mentioned China and Russia in the same breath. There is a very significant Chinese presence in Latin America and the Caribbean today. It is the greatest international non-US presence in the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean than has existed, I would say, since the 19th century. It is major. It is largely commercial and investment. And it is a pillar of the economic development of many Latin American countries. China is the largest trading partner of a good half dozen of the South American countries, and the second largest trading partner of most of the other countries, including not only in South America, but in many countries of the Caribbean. I will return to that question of China in a moment. Russia is a country which has very limited presence in the Americas. It has attempted to make its to increase its presence and to have an influence where it can in Latin America and the Caribbean, and where it can is precisely in those countries which have antagonistic relations with the United States. So it is present as an influence in Venezuela. It has some business and commercial relationships elsewhere, but they are not as important as those of Germany, France, Spain, the United Kingdom. It is minor by comparison, and its geostrategic interest in having a presence in the Americas, I think, has much more to do with reminding the United States and the rest of the world that they need to be taken into account for international issues. It's a way of making people remember that they still exist, because they obviously have declined in influence greatly since the communist period. So first thing was to separate out those two issues. Russia is a presence, a minor irritant, but not a major part of the story of Latin America's international relations. China is a very important part. And this is certainly a great change that has occurred. I published a book in 1988 called Partners in Conflict, the United States and Latin America, which, if I may say so, even if it's immodest, was the standard text in most US university courses on US Latin American relations in that period. It was widely known and used. The word China doesn't appear. The word China doesn't appear in the 250 pages of that book. 20 years ago, in 2000, China was still a relatively minor player and presence in the Americas. But it set out in that year to develop, as part of its global strategy, participating more actively in the Americas, in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as in Africa and elsewhere in the world. And it put forward these plans all in public documents. There was nothing secret about it. It's had an active program of public diplomacy. It has a significant presence. And it has largely been confined to business, to commerce, to the export of Chinese goods, the import of Latin American raw materials and agricultural products. And as the international economy has changed, the Chinese market, made possible by China's spectacular economic growth over the last few decades, has made the Chinese market extremely important for agricultural goods, soybeans, for example, other foodstuffs, poultry, for example, and others, as well as other products from the Americas, but particularly raw materials, copper, iron, etc., lithium, and so on. Now, as China grows and develops, its own national aspirations for influence in the international community have obviously are going to grow and have grown. And China is the largest country in the world. It doesn't yet have the largest economy in the world, but it's on the way. And it has a presence around the world. It has its very ambitious program of infrastructure development around the world. It is a power that needs to be taken into account, and that the United States takes into account, and that Latin American countries take into account by attempting to improve their economic relationships from their standpoint. They also, Latin American countries, realize that it would be just as dangerous to be entirely dependent on Chinese policies, on Chinese prices, on Chinese conditions, as it was to be excessively dependent on US products and markets and rules and dictates during an earlier period of history. The world of the Monroe Doctrine was a world of US policy excluding political influence and significant presence of non-US power in the Americas. It was never eliminating that presence. And in fact, before the Second World War, there was considerable European presence and influence in Latin America, particularly in South America, and very important relationships between the armed forces and military from European countries and from Latin American countries in places like Chile and Argentina and Brazil, as well as other European presence. And the United States lived with that as the nature of the world. We got into a period after the Second World War of receding European influence, of declining European influence, and expanding US influence as US corporations went international, as many aspects of US power were unipolar. And in that environment, it seemed natural that there not be any significant non-US presence in the Americas. But that was a period that was exceptional. And it's been on the decline since the 1960s. And I could, with proper PowerPoint and chart, show that to you in concrete terms. What we in the United States have to do is get our mindset around where the realities are. It's a different international situation. It's a different international economy. We are not in a struggle for control of territory. We're not on the brink of war. We are in a competition in various aspects of international economics with China, and they have gained significant ground in Latin America over the last 20 years, while the United States has been reducing its influence, both unintentionally and through its own policies. So yes, there is a presence. It is something which probably we should think more about how to compete with, and we should think more about how to work with Latin America to develop relations between them and us, between them and the Chinese, and between us and China that are in the mutual interest of all concerned, rather than trying to dictate to Latin American countries what kind of relations they should have, which is an impulse that has its roots in history, but is not really the smartest way to proceed in today's world.
And a follow-up to that, Professor Lowenthal, several countries in Latin America and also Canada were signatories to the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we, under the Trump administration, have chosen to exit. Biden has said that he will attempt to rejoin that activity. Is that a vehicle that Latin America could be an active part of, that could be a way, even though they, as you said earlier, they're really going to be lower on the priority list, but as part of the TPP, is that a way that we can do something as a foreign policy matter with Latin America, even though they are a small part of, or a small, at least the southern part, small part of the TPP?
The first of many setbacks that the Trump administration imposed on U.S. relations with the rest of the world, one of the first was its last-minute withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been very much promoted and developed by the Obama administration. In fact, the reason why the United States under Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was precisely that it was a signal initiative of the Obama administration. And Trump's approach was to be against anything that Obama took credit for. Well, you can understand that at one level, but it's not the way an administration should pursue the national interests of the United States. So Trump obviously had the impression that if the US withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that would bring that initiative to an end. But it didn't bring it to an end. The other countries went ahead with it. And it is now a significant player with some Latin American participation. I think that will continue. I think the Biden administration wants to get more active in international trade discussions. It's got to kind of reverse the English some, because there are resentments about U.S. Trade policies. I mean, this business of imposing tariffs, withdrawing the tariffs, negotiating again, threatening, last minute reimposing, etc., treating this all as just instruments of pressure for tactical immediate advantage on very limited issues. That's not the way trade rules get adopted, developed, and strengthened. And the Biden administration will surely go back to the longer tradition of U.S. Constructive approaches toward international trade arrangements, but it will take some time.
One of our colleagues, Don Shields, asked a pair of questions that are quite related. He asked the question, Latin America has a long history of dictatorships and authoritarian regimes. Why isn't the OAS active in bringing sanctions on those members? And what's the implication of ongoing political difficulties in Latin America relative to dictatorships and authoritarian activity?
Well, Latin America does have a history which includes many periods of authoritarian and military regimes. I'm not sure I would begin a characterization of Latin American politics with that statement, but it is the statement I was confronted with. And it is accurate. It has a history with many such examples. It also has a history of considerable experience and commitment toward democratic governance. Historically, and particularly in the last 35 years, in ending the last period of substantial authoritarian and military governance in the Americas, through the return to democracy in Chile and Argentina, in Uruguay, in Peru, in Ecuador, and many other countries through the region. And I would emphasize that as a significant part of Latin America's political history. Right now, certainly most of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean have democratic governance, elected governments, freely elected. They are not perfect, all of them, in their achievement of full democratic governance with checks and balances and alternability of leadership and with great protection of human rights. They vary. Just as the United States has varied in its historical experience, the United States during this particular electoral period, for example, is certainly not the international model for democratic governance. These things, democracy is something which is like a plant in the garden. It can shrivel up when it's being attacked by pests or ignored in terms of watering and pruning and the like. This is something we should be empathetic about and conscious of our own limits and conscious of how hard it is to keep effective democratic governance working. But it's an important objective. And when the United States on a bipartisan basis has supported for many years, it reached a kind of hemispheric climax in terms of commitment 20 years ago with the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was sponsored by Chile and adopted by the entire membership of the Organization of American States, in which the questioner mentioned, OAS. Now, there are countries in the Americas today that cannot be, even with the qualifications I just gave, it cannot be listed as truly a democratic governance. And I would say those, at the moment, I would say Cuba, Venezuela, and I would say Nicaragua are the three such cases that I don't think applying the term democratic governance to them makes sense in terms of at least my definition of democratic governance. Nicaragua is a little bit harder case because Mr. Ortega gets frequently elected. And I don't think anyone actually doubts that the vote supports him. But he certainly rules as an autocrat. And this is true to differing measures in Venezuela and Cuba. So the questioner asks, why doesn't this change? Why can't the OAS change it? What about sanctions? Well, the Organization of the American States is an organization of member governments. Member governments are the United States, Canada, and all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean except Cuba. And it can only do what those governments authorize and permit. And of course, the governments in question resist efforts by the OAS, even by an aggressive and energetic Secretary General such as Mr. Almagro, who is the current Secretary General, just recently reelected. Sanctions as a way of forcing democratic change have been imposed first by the United States, then by many other countries, including members of the OAS and Europe, and then less and less by other countries, and almost entirely by the United States, over a period of 6 decades against Cuba. They have not been effective. On the contrary, all told, they probably have given the authoritarian regime in Cuba some measure of domestic support in protecting the country against international interference. You know, no one likes to be pushed around. In any case, it's a close question, but it hasn't changed the situation in Cuba. But there have been movements in the direction of democratic governance. There have been reforms to the Cuban Constitution. There have been reforms to how the parliament works. There have been reforms to the electoral system. They don't amount to democratic governance yet, but they at least open a path toward a regime which is not simply a hereditary family enterprise under people named Castro. In fact, most of your participants in this discussion are probably unable to name the president of Cuba today, but it's not Castro. Venezuela, the U.S. has imposed sanctions. It has not secured as much of an international support as it likes. It's one of the pressures of the sanctions are one of the elements that affect the regime. It's hard to be sure whether they increase or decrease the chances of compromise negotiations. In some ways, the best thing the sanctions may amount to eventually is a bargaining chip in negotiations in which, by stages, sanctions can be lifted to reinforce and provide an incentive for reforms. It's not easy. On the other hand, in looking at a country like Venezuela, you have to look at the fact that there must be, and there are, different factions within the governing coalition. Some of them are no doubt convinced that Venezuela would have a better chance to recover from its economic disaster if it had positive economic relations with the United States and if the sanctions went away. And they are smart enough to figure out that they need political reform and political change for that to happen. it's got to engage them and the Venezuelan population. The Venezuelan opposition has an important role to play. They have gone back and forth over the last years between attempting to participate in democratic in elections, even though they know they are rigged against them, and abstaining from the elections on the grounds that this will make the elections illegitimate. But on the other hand, it also means the government will have no problem winning the elections. And they've gone back and forth. They've used each approach. In December 2015, in the national congressional elections, they chose to participate, even though many people on their side were skeptical and said that the whole elections are rigged. They actually won the elections. They won them fair and square. They won a majority in Congress. This time around, they are boycotting the elections again for municipal elections. One Venezuelan political leader, well, several Venezuelan political leaders have defied the boycott. Some of them have then joined the boycott again. I think it's hard on the opposition withholding itself from these elections. They have to find alternate means of establishing their presence and keeping their supporters mobilized. They're talking now about a plebiscite that they would run where they would try to get great turnout to show that people are more participating more in their plebiscite than in the nationally scheduled elections. I'm not sure how far that's going to go, but at least it's a response to this dilemma. In any case, these are hard questions, how to achieve this. As I say, I think I learned a lot from the study we did about the fact that it can be done, that it requires political skill, dexterity, commitment to a vision of a democratic future, but to flexibility and give and take in how you get there. I'll just end my comment on this with one telling anecdote, which I have discussed with many Venezuelans. When Pinochet was in power in Chile, the opposition, democratic opposition to Pinochet, used various techniques and various efforts to try to get rid of Pinochet, all without success. They turned finally to a long shot strategy. Pinochet had imposed a new constitution, the 1980 constitution, on Chile. And one of its provisions was that in 8 years from its adoption in 1988, there would be a national plebiscite run by the government with one question: should the current government be extended for another 8 years? Now, anybody who knows anything about authoritarian governments knows that when they run a plebiscite, they win. You know, it's not that hard. They control the whole system. There was a debate within the opposition about how to, whether to participate in this plebiscite or not. And many prominent leaders of the opposition said, no way, we're not going to participate in this illegitimate plebiscite. It has no legitimacy. It's part of an imposed constitution. And all it's going to do is create the illusion that the public wants the dictator to remain in power. We know better, but we can't win a plebiscite because they're running it. It's illegitimate. We refuse. One of the leaders of the Democratic opposition, Patricio Aylwin, eventually prevailed within the opposition by a counter-argument. He said, you know, of course it's illegitimate, and I will say it's illegitimate to my last breath. But you know, when a speeding automobile breaking all the rules of traffic speeds down the street in front of my house, I call the police and I ask the police to do something about this guy. Why do I do that? Because only the police have the authority to stop such action. How do they get that authority? They get that authority because they're part of the government of Chile. Yeah, they are part of the government of Chile led by dictator Pinochet. I can say, no, I'm going to boycott the police because it's illegitimate. But I recognize pragmatically that the only authorities we have that can deal with the traffic are the police of the Pinochet regime. So I swallow my principle about legitimacy and try to work with them to solve the problem and gain some progress. Well, that was very controversial. It was discussed and discussed, and eventually his view prevailed. And the opposition then organized themselves well to contest the plebiscite. And they won the plebiscite, not by a huge margin, but by a sufficient margin that there was no doubt about its outcome. And the chances are that President Pinochet gave considerable thought to defying the result of the plebiscite. But the armed forces of Chile informed Pinochet that night that the armed forces understood the will of the Chilean people had been registered in the plebiscite. And that was the end of that. Now, there's something to be learned there. There's also something to be learned from a conversation that was recounted to us both by Ricardo Lagos, prominent socialist leader in Chile and eventual president of Chile, and Felipe González, the president of Spain. Each of them told us the same story in separate interviews, that Lagos, as a leader of the socialist part of the opposition, went with some of his colleagues to Spain to discuss their strategy for getting rid of Pinochet. And this was before the plebiscite, before the agreement on a plebiscite. It was in 1986. And they presented to him their plans for getting rid of Pinochet. And González listened to them and said at the end of their presentation, well, all that's very interesting, Ricardo. And I can tell you that if you continue with those plans, you can assure yourself a long and good academic career outside of power. But if you really want to get rid of Pinochet, you can't start with those plans. You have to start by recognizing you're at the bottom of a well, and that your first imperative is to get out of the well. You have to find a way to get out of the well, and with that tiny bit of leverage, you then start building more leverage until you can contest the dictatorship from a position of strength. Lagos was very struck by that advice, and it is for that reason that he eventually came to understand the wisdom of Aylwin's approach to use the 1980 plebiscite as a means of expanding leverage based on a stronger position. And that really turned the future of Chile. All of those anecdotes, I think, are revealing not only about Chilean history, but about the nature of democratic challenges to authoritarian rule. And I believe they are relevant to Venezuela's future.
Mitch Cook, one of our audience, raises the following questions. One of the things that makes the U.S. unique is its relative stability of our post-World War II foreign policy, despite changes in administrations every 4 to 8 years. The Trump presidency has broken this consistency. Can we ever be trusted again as an ally or as a political influence and a social leadership have been irreparably damaged? Or is our foreign policy merely an extension of our economic power?
I understand the first part of that question. I'm not sure about the very last phrase, whether how that is an alternative to the first part, connected by or. So I think I'm going to concentrate on the fundamental question.
Fine.
Can the United States, which has had some consistent and indeed bipartisan approaches to international relations and foreign policy, with some changes of emphasis, with some changes of priority, with some changes of mind, but operating in a strategic way and in a professional way, has managed significant national foreign policies over changes in administration over a long period of time, certainly since the Second World War. Can that power, which had such influence in the world, can it be trusted after a period of so many breaks with traditional US policy, so many renunciations, so many withdrawals, so many attacks on multilateralism, on international cooperation? Can the United States be trusted? I think that's a very good and fair question. And I think the first indications, even prior to the taking, to the assumption of actual power by the president-elect in January, the first indications that I am feeling are quite positive. That is, we haven't blown all of US influence because of 4 years of destructive policies. I say that partly on the basis of anecdotal but important evidence, and that is my correspondence with a number of Latin American colleagues throughout the hemisphere, and participation in Zoom seminars with people who follow international relations in a number of Latin American countries. Simply by being elected, let alone by being president and introducing new policies. The election of Joe Biden has very significantly restored the respect and trust of Latin American colleagues that I'm in touch with in the reliability of United States political institutions and the will of the American people. There, I think, was a great deal of concern in many countries of Latin America that Trump was going to get reelected and was going to be even less restrained in a second period than in the first. And I think the general verdict is that the American public turned out in record numbers for an election they understood was of historic significance. That included a turnout of significant proportions by those who supported President Trump's reelection on the basis of the kind of alienation and rejection I mentioned in my earlier remarks, but an even more impressive turnout in support of Joe Biden, which was partly an endorsement of Mr. Biden individually as a candidate of the Democratic Party, partly an endorsement of the Democratic Party and its platform and programs, and largely a referendum on Trump as president. And I think that's how to interpret it. And 80 million people supported the return of the United States to a more traditional approach to both domestic issues and the US role in the world. So I think the Biden administration starts with the benefit of the doubt in a number of countries. And of course, a lot will depend on what he actually does, what he says, and what he does, whether and how he listens, his responses to key issues and points. And the talk I just gave was by way of both predicting and advocating the directions he might be able to take and be willing to take to restore U.S. influence in that sense. Now, when I say restore U.S. influence, and this may have something to do with the last part of the questioner posed, U.S. influence in the world is based on a number of things. It's based on economic power and competitiveness, as the questioner mentioned. It's based on the values, ideals, institutions, and soft power of the United States, a very significant asset for the United States historically, somewhat damaged in the last 4 years. It's based on the institutional strength of the United States, not only in the government, but in the civil society, in the nonprofit world, in the world of associations and responses to all kinds of issues, something which the United States has been very strong in, which has declined somewhat since the 1960s, but has been on the upswing in part because of a reaction to the Trump presidency and to other issues, including race questions and the pandemic and public health and so on. So it's also based on the military power and strength of the United States, which is unequal and far, far distant from any other country in the world. All of this together underlies U.S. influence, as does the representation of the United States, its diplomacy, and its public diplomacy, and its way of dealing with the outside world. In my remarks about Dick Dye, I concluded by saying that the ability to adhere to core values without hectoring others, instructing them, imposing them, but rather setting an example and supporting those in other countries who share those values. That is what Dick Dye was all about. That is what the best of American foreign policy has been about. And that is not what has been prominent in the last 4 years. I think it should be relatively easy for Joe Biden to recapture some of the respect the United States has lost by adhering to those approaches in a consistent way.
Professor Lowenthal, we thank you for your thoughts, for your time and effort, for your generosity, for your comments about Dick. I think the closing comments about Dick was a perfect tribute, but also a perfect closing set of comments about the kinds of things that we at the foreign policy at Chappaqua are trying to convey to our friends and families and others around us. I thank you so much, and I'm going to turn the program over to Tyler Beebe, who will take us home.
Thanks, Mel. Well, just another and final thanks to our guest, Professor Abe Lowenthal, to Mal, our session facilitator, Joan Kuhn from the Chappaqua Library, to Carrie Krams from the Newcastle Media Arts Center, and to all of you who joined us, especially Anita Dye and her family. In 2 weeks, on December 7th, we will host Professor Angela Stent from Georgetown University. She is an expert on Russia, and she'll speak to us on Putin's long game. Should be a very interesting session. I will be the moderator of that session on December 7th. If you have any friends and family who would like to join us this fall, please email Joan Kuhn at jkuhn, Kuhn, @ wlsmail.org so that we may be sure to add you or them to the invitations list. So until we meet again on December 7th, have a good day, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abe. That was
Thanks.
beautiful. I'll keep in touch.
Very good. And to Dick, Richie, who is listening, I want to say hello as well.
Oh, he's there. And so is Callie.
Oh, good.
We're all there. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
That was
you.
perfect.